They came at dawn, 3 men in gray uniforms, one repossession order, and no explanation beyond what the paperwork required. Owen Callahan stood outside his own garage and watched someone else's padlock replace his. 22 years of work, 17 years of hard-earned reputation. 4 years of carefully building something no one could take, sealed in 12 minutes by a company he had trusted with a signature. But 3 weeks later, the $2 million armored truck belonging to that same company sat dead on a deserted highway, with $42 million locked inside. And the only name they called was Owen Callahan. What happens when the man whose life you destroyed turns out to be the only one who can save you? Owen Callahan was 33 years old, and he had never done anything halfway in his life. He had grown up watching his father work on fleet vehicles at a county maintenance yard, learned the difference between a torque spec and a guess before he was old enough to drive, and spent the next 2 decades refining a skill set that most mechanics never touched. Owen did not fix ordinary cars. He specialized in heavy-duty modified vehicles, armored transport units, high-value security carriers, tactical civilian platforms, the kind of machines that governments and private firms trusted with, things they could not afford to lose. That specialization had its roots in a contract position at Fort Bragg, where Owen spent 6 years working alongside military engineers on vehicle hardening and systems integration before deciding he would rather answer to himself. By the time he opened his shop on Meridian Street in Raleigh, North Carolina, he already had a waiting list, and the clients on it were not ordinary clients. The garage was not large by any commercial measure, 3 working bays, a parts storage room that Owen had organized with the same precision he applied to everything else, and a small front office with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a coffee machine that ran 12 hours a day. But what the building lacked in square footage it more than compensated for in reputation. Owen held 3 annual maintenance contracts with regional security transport companies, a vehicle certification agreement with a mid-size logistics corporation that needed federally compliant fleet inspections, and a private client list that had grown entirely through referrals. He had never placed an advertisement. He worked 6 days a week and still had more requests than he could schedule. The tools on his benches were worn not from neglect but from honest use, and the floor carried the kind of permanent oil stain that only comes from years of doing the same difficult thing in the same place without ever cutting corners. He had built a serious business and he knew it, not because anyone had told him so but because the work kept coming. The financing had seemed reasonable at the time. Owen had taken a secured equipment loan through Meridian Capital Holdings to purchase a hydraulic lift platform and a diagnostic system capable of interfacing with the proprietary firmware architectures used in armored vehicle electronics. The interest rate was not favorable, but the terms gave him room to manage cash flow, and the equipment had paid for itself within 18 months. What Owen had not fully anticipated was the way Meridian Capital conducted business when a borrower fell behind. He had missed 2 payments during a period when a major contract was delayed by a client's internal audit, contacted Meridian Capital twice requesting restructuring, once in writing and once by phone, and both requests were declined without a stated reason. The third notice arrived on a Tuesday morning and included a repossession timeline that gave him 11 days to resolve a balance of $97,000 or surrender the secured assets. Owen read the notice 3 times, set it on the corner of his desk, and went back to work on the hydraulic actuator he had been rebuilding. He was not a man who panicked easily. He had been in tighter positions in his life, situations where failure carried consequences, measured in something other than money, and he had learned that the most useful response to a crisis was to continue doing what he knew how to do. He called a small business attorney that afternoon and left a message, then pulled out the original loan documents and spent 2 hours reading every clause, including the ones he had skim-read during signing, marking anything that seemed worth noting with a pencil. He found one passage in particular, Clause 14, titled Priority Maintenance Right, that he had insisted be included during the original negotiation. At the time it had seemed like standard protection. He read it twice, set it aside, and did not think about it again for 3 weeks. Sebastian Drake was 41 years old, and the most dangerous thing about him was that he never seemed dangerous at all. He operated as Meridian Capital's Director of Operations with the affect of someone running through a routine checklist, calm, methodical, completely absent of anything that might be described as personal feeling. He did not raise his voice, did not make threats, and processed financial instruments and asset positions the way an accountant processes a quarterly report, and if the processing occasionally resulted in someone losing the thing they had built with their hands over many years, that was simply what the numbers required. He understood from long experience that the most effective way to conduct business of the kind he conducted was to ensure that every action was procedurally correct and that no individual step looked like anything other than standard practice. Taken together, the steps formed a pattern that was quite different from standard practice, but by then it was usually too late for anyone to trace it cleanly. What no one outside a narrow circle of Meridian Capital's internal structure knew was that Sebastian Drake also held an undisclosed advisory position with a competing logistics security firm, actively looking to expand its maintenance infrastructure in the Raleigh market. The garage on Meridian Street, with its existing client contracts and specialized equipment, was exactly what that firm needed. It was faster and cheaper to absorb a repossessed asset than to build one from scratch, and the repossession timeline was already running. Adrian Voss arrived at Owen's garage at 7:14 in the morning on a Thursday, accompanied by 2 property agents and a complete set of repossession documentation. Adrian was 35, Meridian Capital's legal representative for asset recovery, and he had done this enough times to have developed a kind of practiced neutrality about it. He read each item from the inventory list as it was sealed, gave Owen the legally required time to review each form before signing, and did not make the mistake of offering sympathy or explanation because he had learned that both only made the process harder. Owen signed each form without argument because there was no legal ground to stand on, and he understood that clearly. He stood in the doorway of the front office and watched the first bay get sealed, then the second, then the third, then the parts room. Each padlock going on was a different sound from the ones before it, and Owen registered all of them. The process took 12 minutes. When it was finished, Adrian Voss handed Owen a copy of the final inventory summary, told him the contact number for appeals, and walked back to the vehicle at the curb without looking back. Owen stood in the empty doorway for a moment before he walked to his truck. He had already moved his personal hand tools to the bed the night before. Under the law, personal hand tools were not classified as secured assets and could not be repossessed. He had the tools he could carry, his phone, and the marked-up copy of the loan agreement still folded in his jacket pocket. What he also had, though he had not fully registered it yet, was a memory. Just before the last bay was sealed, he had noticed a truck parked at the curb 2 houses down from his garage. It was a late-model armored carrier, midnight blue, with a logo on the side panel he did not recognize at the time but would look up that evening. Vanguard Secure Transport. He filed it without knowing why. The same way a man who has spent years diagnosing mechanical failures files the sound of something he has not yet identified, without urgency, because experience has taught him that detail tends to matter eventually. 3 weeks passed the way difficult weeks always do, not fast, not clean, and not without cost. Owen set up a temporary work area in the parking lot of a shuttered grocery store on the east side of Raleigh, where the property owner had agreed to let him use the space in exchange for a flat monthly rate that was low enough to be manageable. He laid down tarps, assembled his folding tool racks, and accepted the jobs he could do without a lift or electronic diagnostic support, brake work, fluid systems, basic drivetrain repairs for clients who knew him well enough to follow him to an asphalt parking lot with no roof over it. The work that had defined his business, the deep systems work, the armored vehicle maintenance, the firmware-level diagnostics, was completely out of reach in those conditions. He worked anyway because stopping was not a real option and he did not treat it as one. He was not a man who narrated his suffering to anyone who would listen. His situation was what it was, and the only path through it was to keep working and to keep thinking. He placed calls to 2 equipment leasing companies about long-term rental agreements for a hydraulic platform. He followed up with the attorney, who confirmed that the restructuring refusal had been procedurally irregular but that proving damages would take time and documentation. Owen gathered the documentation with the same systematic care he brought to everything else, organizing the files in a plastic folder he kept in his truck's glove compartment so that nothing would get lost or damaged in the parking lot conditions he was working under. He reread the loan agreement again on the fourth night, sitting on a folding chair with a flashlight because the parking lot lights went out at midnight, and this time when he reached Clause 14 he held the page under the beam for a long time. The clause stated that within 90 days of asset repossession, in cases where the lender utilized the repossessed assets for commercial purposes, the original borrower retained a priority right to be offered maintenance and service contracts related to those assets. Owen had included it because he had once seen a competitor lose equipment to a bank and then watch the bank's affiliated company earn revenue from what had been seized. He had wanted protection, he had gotten it in writing, and then, until that night in the parking lot with a flashlight, he had nearly forgotten it existed. He did not know yet what he would do with it. But he wrote the clause number down in the margin of his notepad and circled it twice, and that was enough for now. Madison Clark had turned 28 in April and had spent the morning of her birthday reviewing fleet insurance renewals because that was the kind of person she was. She had not inherited Vanguard Secure Transport. She had built it from a 3-vehicle private security company she purchased with money she had saved, borrowed, and worked for over 4 years before she was old enough to feel fully confident she knew what she was doing. By the time Owen Callahan was setting up tarps in a parking lot, Vanguard operated a fleet of 21 armored carriers serving financial institutions, private equity firms, and logistics conglomerates across 5 states. Madison did not have a mechanical background. What she had was an extraordinary sensitivity to risk. She understood at a structural level how systems failed, and she had built Vanguard's entire operational protocol architecture around that understanding. She ran a tight organization and expected the same tightness from every vendor and partner she worked with, and she had a specific, well-developed intolerance for situations where a preventable failure had not been prevented. The vehicle in question was the newest addition to the Vanguard fleet. A ballistic Series 7 armored carrier custom configured, purchased for just over $2 million and delivered 4 months prior with full manufacturer's certification and warranty coverage. The Series 7 was a genuinely sophisticated machine. Its cargo compartment ran a 3-layer electromagnetic locking system that could not be manually overridden without a specific authorization sequence. Its wheel assembly incorporated run-flat technology paired with an automatic tire pressure control module that monitored and adjusted pressure in real time across varying load and road conditions. The onboard diagnostic architecture was proprietary, designed to communicate only with certified manufacturer hardware, and included a firmware management layer that controlled how the vehicle's electronic systems communicated with one another. It was, in short, a machine that trusted very few people and was not apologetic about it. The transport that morning involved a scheduled delivery of negotiable bonds belonging to a private investment consortium, $42 million in instruments that needed to reach a custodial bank in Durham by end of business. The run was standard, the route was established, and the crew was experienced. 80 kilometers into the journey, on a quiet stretch of interstate between Raleigh and Durham, the vehicle simply stopped. Not because of a mechanical failure in any traditional sense, the engine was intact, the fuel system was fine, the driveline was undamaged. What happened was that the entire electronic architecture of the vehicle entered a locked fault state. The cargo compartment electromagnetic locks refused to disengage. The tire pressure control module began broadcasting a critical system error that the onboard display could not resolve, and the diagnostic screen cycled through a cascade of error codes that none of the crew or the 2 technicians dispatched from Vanguard's operations center had ever encountered in any configuration. The vehicle was operational in the sense that it could not be destroyed. It simply could not be used. Madison took the call in her office at 11:47 in the morning. She asked 3 questions in sequence: whether the cargo was secure, whether the crew was safe, and who was currently en route to address the fault. The answer to the 3rd question was that the Vanguard field technicians were already on site and that the manufacturer had been contacted. Madison set the phone on her desk and looked at the wall for approximately 4 seconds before picking it back up. She knew what the manufacturer's field response time was. She had read the warranty documentation herself. 72 hours minimum for a critical systems fault with active cargo involvement. The transport contract required delivery within 14 hours of departure. 3 hours and 11 minutes had already passed, and not one of those minutes was coming back. The field technicians connected their diagnostic hardware, and the vehicle rejected the connection entirely. The Ballistic Series 7 security firmware included an external interference protocol designed to prevent unauthorized access to the vehicle's electronic systems during transport. Any diagnostic device that was not manufacturer certified triggered an automatic deep lockdown at firmware level, which meant the vehicle would not communicate with anything not specifically whitelisted in its system registry. The 3 Vanguard technicians had certified hardware for routine maintenance, not for a firmware-level fault of this complexity. The nearest authorized dealership was in Charlotte, a 2-hour drive, and their senior diagnostic technician held only a Level 2 certification. The Level 3 technician required for a firmware-level intervention was based in Atlanta. Vanguard's operations center called the manufacturer's emergency line and was told that an exception to the 72-hour timeline would require internal approval from 3 separate departments, including legal because third-party cargo was involved. The operations center manager wrote down the information, looked at it for a moment, and then put it aside because it was not useful. Levi Nash had worked in armored vehicle logistics for 21 years, and he was not someone who wasted time on panic. He was 55, broad-shouldered, and had the particular steadiness of a man who had seen enough crises to know that the only useful response was methodical thinking. He ran Vanguard's field operations as Madison's most senior director, and he sat in the crisis room, working through every option systematically as each one closed. When the manufacturer call ended without resolution, he sat back and went through what he knew that the protocol sheet did not cover. 6 months earlier, before Vanguard had signed with its current maintenance provider, the arrangement that had come about after certain Raleigh assets changed hands through Meridian Capital, there had been an independent technician in the area who had performed certification inspections on 2 older model armored carriers for a freight company Levi had briefly consulted for. That technician had found a pre-existing hydraulic fault in one of the vehicles that the manufacturer's own certification team had cleared 2 months prior. Levi had noted the name at the time because finding a fault the manufacturer missed was not a small thing, and in this industry small things had a way of becoming large ones at the worst possible moments. He found the name in his phone's contact notes: Owen Callahan, Meridian Street, Raleigh. Levi brought the name to Madison and kept his voice neutral when he explained the rest of it. Owen Callahan no longer had a garage. Meridian Capital had repossessed his shop 3 weeks ago. Madison looked at Levi for a moment, then looked across the table at Sebastian Drake, who had arrived at the crisis meeting 40 minutes earlier and had been offering measured assessments of the situation in his usual unhurried way. She said 2 words: "Find him." Sebastian Drake reached for his phone and began composing a message to Adrian Voss. Owen was sitting on his folding chair in the parking lot when his phone rang at 3:15 in the afternoon. He did not recognize the number and answered anyway. The voice on the other end was Adrian Voss, the same man who had stood in his front office 3 weeks earlier and read inventory items from a clipboard while Owen signed them over. Voss spoke in his characteristic way, which was to frame things as requests while making clear they were not. Owen listened without interrupting, let Voss finish the full account: the stranded vehicle, the failed diagnostics, the delivery timeline, the client relationship at stake, and when Voss stopped talking, Owen asked one question: was this vehicle registered to Vanguard Secure Transport, the company with a corporate relationship to Meridian Capital Holdings? Voss confirmed that it was. Owen said he would call back, set the phone on his knee, and did not pick it up again for 31 minutes. Those 31 minutes were not spent in anger, and they were not spent in calculation. Owen sat with his hands rested on his knees and thought about what he actually believed about work. He believed that a machine broken on a highway was a machine that needed fixing, and that the question of who owned it had nothing to do with whether he was capable of fixing it. He also believed that walking into a situation created by people who had taken everything he built and asking nothing in return for the privilege of saving them was not a thing he was willing to do. He had terms not because he was a man who liked leverage, but because he was a man who knew the value of what he did and had spent the last 3 weeks being reminded of what happened when he let other people set that value for him. 31 minutes was enough time to be clear about the difference. When Owen did call back, he did not call Adrian Voss. He pulled up the Vanguard Secure Transport website, found the executive contact section, and dialed the number listed for the chief executive's office. Madison Clark answered on the second ring, which surprised him slightly. He introduced himself, confirmed that he had spoken with Adrian Voss, and stated that he was willing to drive to the vehicle and assess the situation. Then he laid out his terms without preamble. The first condition was that 30% of his diagnostic service fee would be transferred before he arrived at the site, regardless of whether he was able to fix the problem. The second condition was that no Vanguard technicians and no Meridian Capital representatives would be present in his immediate working area for the duration of his assessment. He would work alone, and that arrangement was not open to modification. Madison agreed to the first condition without hesitation. She was quiet for 5 seconds after the second, then said she understood and would arrange it. Owen thanked her, stood up from the folding chair, and began packing his kit with the focused efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was about to need. He drove to the site in his truck, which was 12 years old and needed a wheel bearing but was otherwise reliable. The stranded vehicle was on the highway shoulder with orange cones set in a standard exclusion perimeter, 2 Vanguard security personnel holding the outer line, and 3 technicians standing near the front of the carrier with the unmistakable posture of people who have run out of ideas. Owen parked behind the last cone, got out, and took his time walking the entire perimeter of the vehicle before touching anything. He noted the tire condition, the undercarriage clearance, the state of the external camera housings, the seal condition on the cargo bay door. He crouched at the front left wheel and examined the sensor housing for the tire pressure module. He stood, he looked at the rear cargo bay latch assembly. Then he opened his toolkit, removed a compact device roughly the size of a paperback book, and connected it to a low access port beneath the driver's side running board. One of the Vanguard technicians said loudly enough to be heard that the vehicle had already rejected every diagnostic tool they had tried. Owen did not respond. What Owen had connected was not a standard automotive diagnostic interface. It was a low-level CAN bus signal reader, the internal communications architecture that modern vehicles use to allow different electronic modules to talk to one another. Standard diagnostic tools worked by querying the vehicle's high-level error reporting system, which the Series 7 security firmware had locked entirely. Owen's device did not attempt to communicate with the high-level system. It simply listened to the raw data traffic moving through the network at the lowest layer of the architecture, the way someone might press an ear to a wall rather than knock on the door. He had built the modification himself during a contract project that required analysis of electronic evidence in a damaged vehicle, and it was one of roughly a dozen tools in his bag that had no commercially available equivalent. The data that came back was dense, and to anyone without deep experience inside armored vehicle electronics it would have been, essentially, unreadable. To Owen it told a clear and specific story in about 8 minutes. He moved to the cargo bay door sensor housing and removed the cover panel with a flat blade tool. The third impact sensor in the array, a small component designed to detect collision forces and trigger emergency lockdown if they exceeded a threshold, showed traces of a residue that was not road grime, not hydraulic fluid, and not weathering. Owen held the housing at an angle to the afternoon light and examined the film on the contact surface. It was a clear liquid residue with a faint chemical smell he recognized immediately. Electronic board cleaner, the solvent used to strip contamination from circuit boards during maintenance inspections. It was useful for certain applications and completely wrong to use near-impact sensors in an armored system because it carried a low but measurable electrical conductivity that, under high operating temperatures, could generate a false positive signal, a phantom collision reading that would trigger the emergency lockdown protocol and hold it in a continuous loop until the system was manually reset through a procedure that required access the Vanguard team did not have. Someone had cleaned that sensor housing with the wrong product, the residue had dried to near invisibility, and on a highway with the vehicle's exterior surface at full operating temperature, it was enough to convince the system it was under attack. Owen set the sensor housing aside and returned to the CAN bus data. The second finding took 22 minutes of log analysis. 3 days before the transport, Someone had pushed a firmware update to the tire pressure control module. The update was not logged in Vanguard's official maintenance records. It had been uploaded through a service port using credentials associated with Vanguard's current Raleigh maintenance provider, the company that had been awarded the armored fleet contracts after Owen's shop was absorbed into Meridian Capital's asset portfolio. The update appeared routine, but it contained a single subroutine that created a communication conflict between the pressure module and the cargo lock controller when both systems reported errors simultaneously. It was the kind of conflict that would never surface in normal operating conditions. It required two things to go wrong at the same time. Someone had made sure two things would go wrong at the same time. Owen worked through the repair methodically, without rushing and without announcing what he was doing to anyone standing nearby. He isolated the faulty impact sensor from the circuit, dried the contact points with a lint-free wipe and the correct grade solvent from a sealed container in his kit, and performed a manual reset of the emergency lockdown protocol through a bootstrap sequence, documented in the Series 7's technical reference materials not distributed through standard dealer channels but that Owen had received during a collaborative engineering consultation with one of the vehicle's original design team members the prior year. The firmware conflict was a more complex problem. Owen did not attempt to reverse the unauthorized update directly, because doing so without manufacturer-authorized tools carried a risk of corrupting the firmware layer entirely. Instead, he wrote a short override patch for the conflict subroutine and loaded it through the vehicle's debug port, which bypassed the security authentication requirement and allowed him to address the specific conflict without touching the rest of the firmware architecture. The patch was 41 lines. It took him 16 minutes to write and 4 minutes to load and verify. 1 hour and 42 minutes after Owen connected his first device, the cargo compartment lock system cycled through its release sequence with a sound like a low, hydraulic exhale, and the diagnostic display moved from a red fault cascade to a steady green operational status. None of the 3 Vanguard technicians said anything. Owen disconnected his equipment, cleaned the sensor housing carefully, and replaced the cover panel. Then he stood, picked up his toolkit, and looked directly at the mounted camera on the vehicle's rear housing, the unit that transmitted a live feed to Vanguard's operations center. He held the look for 3 seconds. He was not performing anything. He was making a decision. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out a pocket drive, connected it to the same low access port he had used at the start, pulled a complete copy of the CAN bus session log, and walked back to his truck without saying anything to anyone on the shoulder of the highway. That evening, Owen sent Madison Clark a single email attachment, the full annotated CAN bus log, from the session, with 3 lines of technical notes identifying the sensor contamination source and the unauthorized firmware entry point. No requests, no additional commentary. He sent it at 9:47 and went to sleep in the back seat of his truck because his temporary rental arrangement did not include overnight accommodation. Madison read the file at 11 that evening. She read it twice, then called Levi Nash. By midnight, they had traced the firmware upload back to its origin, a service account belonging to Vanguard's current Raleigh maintenance provider, the company that had taken on the armored fleet contracts after Owen's shop was absorbed into Meridian Capital's holdings. The chemical residue matched the board cleaner that the same provider had used during its most recent scheduled inspection of the Series 7, 2 days before the transport run. Levi ran the account activity log and found 2 additional anomalies in the maintenance records. Entries that had been altered and one that had been deleted entirely. Madison sat at her desk with the full data laid in front of her and said 3 words very quietly. This was deliberate. The motive was not complicated once the financial structure became visible. The transport contract included a delay penalty clause. Every hour of delay beyond a 6-hour threshold triggered a payment of 0.5% of the cargo's total value from Vanguard to the client. On a $42 million shipment, the numbers were material, but the penalty was not the real damage. The real damage was the framework agreement, a 3-year contract worth substantially more than any single run, which required successful completion of this delivery as a qualifying condition. If Vanguard failed this transport, the framework agreement was void. The competing firm most positioned to absorb that contract was a company that Meridian Capital had been quietly capitalizing through a separate investment vehicle for 14 months. Sebastian Drake appeared as an advisor to that vehicle's holding company in a corporate filing that the Vanguard legal team located in approximately 40 minutes once they knew where to look. Madison called Sebastian Drake at 7:15 the following morning and told him she needed him in the conference room at 9. She did not tell him why. When he arrived, she placed the full documentation on the table, the firmware log, the maintenance records, the financial structure connecting Meridian to the competing firm, and asked him to explain it. Sebastian Drake's explanation was the kind that was technically complete and structurally evasive. The maintenance provider was being investigated internally. He had no direct involvement in their technical operations. The firmware upload was under review. He spoke with the same measured evenness that had characterized every conversation he had. Madison listened without expression, then told him that the documentation had been forwarded to the state's Financial Oversight Commission and that a formal complaint had been filed. Sebastian Drake left the conference room without any agreement having been reached, and in the hallway he checked his phone and found a notification from Meridian Capital's legal department. An injunction request against the original asset seizure had been filed that morning, citing Clause 14 of the loan agreement. It had not been filed by Vanguard. It was filed by Owen Callahan. The legal argument was straightforward. Owen's attorney submitted that Meridian Capital had violated its own contract terms by transferring the repossessed garage assets directly to a related commercial entity rather than offering them through a public auction process as required under secured lending regulations. The transfer had occurred within 11 days of seizure, meaning Owen had never had a genuine opportunity to redeem the asset. Clause 14's priority maintenance right had been deliberately circumvented by a party that stood to benefit commercially from its circumvention. The filing also referenced the firmware event and the maintenance provider's documented role in it, which elevated the matter from a contract dispute to something the State Financial Oversight Commission chose to examine on its own initiative. The Commission opened a preliminary review of Meridian Capital's repossession portfolio, not just Owen's case but a broader audit of the firm's asset seizure and transfer practices over 26 months. Madison Clark signed the 3-year framework agreement with the bond consortium 10 days later. The delivery had arrived 90 minutes late, within a force majeure window that Levi Nash had invoked using a provision in the contract covering mechanical failure events outside the carrier's reasonable control. The provision required documentation. Owen's annotated log was part of that documentation, submitted as supporting evidence for the force majeure claim, and the client accepted it without dispute. The maintenance provider's contract with Vanguard was suspended pending investigation, and Levi Nash drafted a recommendation for the executive team proposing that Vanguard establish a direct service agreement with an independent specialist rather than routing maintenance through a third-party management company. The proposal named Owen Callahan. It included a provision for advance capital support to cover the cost of establishing a new workshop facility, structured as a recoverable advance against the contract value. Madison approved it on a Thursday afternoon without convening a full committee meeting. She did not phone Owen to tell him. She sent a short email. The subject line was a reference number. The body contained 2 sentences. The framework contract had been executed, and his service fee balance plus the advance capital had been transferred to his account. It was signed with her initials. That was how she conducted business when the matter was resolved and did not require elaboration. Owen read the email on a Saturday morning while sitting in the parking lot with a cup of coffee, going cold beside him. He read it once, set his phone down on the tool rack, and looked at the sky for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and went through the list of clients who had called his old number in the past 7 weeks asking when he was reopening. There were 19 of them. He went through the list methodically, marking each one with a note on what they had needed and whether the work was likely still pending. When he was done, he folded the notebook and put it in his jacket pocket. He had calls to make on Monday. The new space was on Meridian Street, 4 buildings down from the old one. It was smaller, 2 bays instead of 3. A parts room that would require tighter organization to compensate for the reduced footprint, and a front office barely large enough for the desk and the filing cabinet. Owen took possession on a Monday morning, drove his truck to the rear of the building, unloaded his tools onto the floor of the first bay, and spent the next 4 hours arranging them according to the same system he had used for 17 years. The shelving was different. The walls were a different color. The lighting was newer and brighter than he was accustomed to, but the floor was bare concrete, and once his tools were laid out on it, the space already felt familiar in the way that workspaces feel familiar, not because of what they look like, but because of what they are for. He had rebuilt before on a smaller scale in worse conditions. He knew how this part went. Sebastian Drake resigned from Meridian Capital 6 days after the commission review became public, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities. Adrian Voss was interviewed by commission investigators twice and retained personal legal counsel before the second session. The maintenance provider that had been awarded Owen's absorbed contracts surrendered its operating license after inspectors found 3 additional technical violations on vehicles in its care that had previously been signed off as certified. The broader audit of Meridian Capital's repossession portfolio identified 11 cases in which seized assets had been transferred to related entities without proper disclosure, and the legal processes attached to those findings would move at the pace such things always moved: slow, methodical, and indifferent to the urgency of the people involved. Owen was not involved in any of it. His attorney handled the filings. Owen worked. He called back the 19 clients from his list, scheduled the ones who still needed service, and turned down 2 who had moved on to other providers because he was not the kind of man who expected loyalty from people he had been unable to serve for 7 weeks. The first Vanguard vehicle came in on a Friday for routine inspection, one of the older series. 5 carriers that Levi Nash had kept in service past its scheduled replacement date because the budget allocation had shifted. Owen went over it with the same thoroughness he applied to every vehicle regardless of age or condition, found a secondary hydraulic seal beginning to show fatigue stress that no one else had flagged, documented it properly, and submitted the report with a replacement recommendation and a cost estimate that was fair and accurate and required no further explanation. On a Tuesday evening in late fall, he sat in the front office after the bay lights had gone down, reading through the next week's scheduling. The coffee machine on the desk was the same one from the old office. He had retrieved it from the repossession inventory list as a personal item during the appeals process, and the reviewer had let it through without argument. The desk had come from a second-hand supplier and had a small dent in the left front corner that was not worth fixing. The filing cabinet was new and did not yet have the particular resistance of a drawer that has been opened 1,000 times. He noted all of this without sentiment, the way a man notes the condition of a new workspace, simply registering what was there and what still needed to become what it was going to become over time. Owen did not think about Sebastian Drake. He did not think about the garage 3 blocks up the road with someone else's padlock on it. He thought about the Series 7 scheduled for its quarterly review in 8 days, and whether the firmware issue had been fully resolved by the manufacturer's official patch or whether there was residual risk in the conflict subroutine he had temporarily bridged. He made a note to request the full firmware changelog from the manufacturer before the vehicle arrived. The office light was still on at 9 in the evening. The street outside was quiet. Owen finished his notes, capped his pen, and turned off the light on his way out. He had work in the morning, and he did not believe in keeping himself awake longer than the day required. The door locked behind him with a clean, solid click, a sound that belonged to him.